This video about action buttons is quite extensive. We're going a bit above and beyond to use the scenarios to show real application cases. This time, you may want to skim through the video at first and come back later for a more in-depth review. Anyway, let's get started. Sign in to the app with Books. Here we have the main cards with authors, and each one has a list of books on what we call linked cards. This time we're going to create a personal library where people can add books, leave a rating, and mark books as read. Go to the Library page and add two tabs, Library and My Books. We'll use the My Books tab to add titles to our personal library. To do that, create a new data structure. Users Books. Then you need to configure the fields and add a link to the user whose book it is. That will be a link to the web user structure. Next, a link to a book, which is a link to the books structure. In essence, we create a copy of a book for the user to work with. Then you need to add another field, Status. This shows whether a book is read or unread, and will be a simple string, which of course means simple text. Then a poster, and that's an image. Finally, a title, which is also a simple string. Select the title as a visible name for this structure. Then go to the API tab and create a new endpoint. We learned how to create and configure endpoints in a previous video. This endpoint will be private, that is, non-public. In the configuration menu, make all fields available for reading and add a filter. User ID equals ID, so we only get a particular user's books. Next, configure the cards view for the My Books tab. This could also be a table or even a Kanban. Select the endpoint and look at the tab in the app. It's still empty because you haven't added new objects yet. Now we'll use action buttons to create objects in the user's book structure. Let's not touch the Web3 topic yet, and simply say that action buttons are just requests to write to an endpoint. You're free to choose the endpoint and what to write to it. Okay, let's configure an action button. It's just going to be a button, no form. Choose a name and icon. Note that you have to use a different endpoint, not the one associated with the cards component. You'll find the button in the Cards Object tab settings. It can also be seen on the Author's card in the app. Well, the thing is, the button should appear on the linked card with a book, not on the Author's card, because you're adding a book to a personal library. You need to change the setting and show the action button on the linked card. Now you see it among other settings in the Objects tab. Save and check the changes. Now you have a book, a linked card, and a button that doesn't do anything because it's not connected to an endpoint. Now you need to create a separate data structure for user actions. This will generate a new object, that is, a user request, with information about what button was pressed and who pressed it. Next, configure the fields and add a new one, request type. It will allow you to use the same data structure with different components, and these components will cause different events. Don't forget to add these fields: a link to the user who made the request, a link to a book, and a link to an author. You can leave the author field empty if you have to. Great. Save the changes and create a new API endpoint, user requests, for this data structure. Mark only the ID field as available for reading because at least one field has to be. and mark all the fields as available for writing. You don't need to mark the ID field as available for writing because you'll create objects. You'll also need to configure validation for the user ID field. User ID equals ID. That is the ID of the user using the endpoint. This is a security check to prevent tampering with actions through the API. OK, back to configuring the action button. Choose the new endpoint you just created. You need that to save new objects, specifically user requests. Next, configure the mapping. Take the book ID from the linked card ID. This is the card with the button. Then take the author ID from the main or object card, not the linked card. Add a constant, let's call it addUsersBook, to the request type field. Fill in the user ID field with the user ID. That's the ID of the user working with the component. You can leave action conditionals empty for now. Save the changes and check them. Go to the app and press the button on a linked book card. Well, it looks as though something has happened, but for some reason the button remains, and we can't see whether a book has been added to the personal library or not. Let's add a message. The book has been added to my library. To make things clear, save the changes and go and look at the user requests data structure. A new object should have appeared after you last clicked the button. There it is. Note that a new object has all fields filled in correctly. The type, links to the book and author, and the user. Check how the action button works now. After clicking the button, you see the message. That is very convenient, isn't it? Check the user requests data structure again. You press the button twice, and 2 objects have appeared. Great! Now, let's create a scenario to handle those objects. All new objects, or user requests, from the user requests data structure will trigger this scenario. The first thing you need to do is set a condition. For this, you need to use the condition step. Remember to add comments to the scenario to make it easy to follow in future. Set the condition to request type equals addUsersBook. If no, the scenario stops, and if yes, it will search for objects, meaning it will check whether that book has already been added. The search step has to save the results somewhere, so let's use context variables. Add a new context variable called myBookID. It will be a link to the user's book structure. This step will use the structure to search for an object and save the result as an array of links. You can save the result as either a quantity or sum. It doesn't matter which. You are interested in the fact itself, which, in this case, you can save as an array of links. OK, next, in the search conditions, specify that from the request, bookID equals bookID and user ID equals user ID. This means that the user has already added this book. We've already covered the search step in another video, but in short, these conditions will help you to compare the fields of an object from the structure you're searching in with an object being processed by the scenario. Add another condition after the search step. You must check whether an object was found, meaning that a context variable is empty. If yes, the scenario keeps running, and if no, the scenario stops. And again, don't forget to add comments. If the search result is empty, you'll need to create a new object in the user's books structure. We've also covered the create object step in detail in another video, and here you use it in a simplified way to create a new object. This object's ID is generated automatically. And all you have to do is configure the mapping so that the new object's title field will look like this. The author's first and last names, then, followed by a dash, the title and year of publication. Now, fill in the rest of the fields. Add a poster from the linked book. We use link field, dot, and then the linked object's field name. Then add a status field, just one word, new. Then a link to the book. The link field, as I'm sure you remember, stores the object ID you're referring to. Save the changes, then publish and run the scenario. It will now process all new objects. You can also process old objects by using the debug menu. Just copy the object ID and run the scenario. And as you see from the logs, everything went well. The object has been created. Now let's process a second object. Now, the user can see both objects that were created by the scenario. Let's configure how these cards are displayed and make them a little nicer by, at the very least, adding a poster. Which will cover the entire width of the card and be 200 pixels high. Now the cards look more attractive. Let's test our scenario by adding another book to the personal library, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. It appeared in the My Books tab with all the fields filled in. Let's try adding the same book again and, as you see, there is no twin. The scenario worked correctly. In the logs, you can see how the objects were handled. One object didn't pass the condition that nothing was found, and the search step result is seen in the context variable. Next, let's configure the status model for the My Books tab by using the action buttons to change the status on a card. First, the status needs to be displayed on the card. You can move the poster to the top of the card to make the status message easier to read. Next, let's add an action button. It will use the same endpoint as the card, so you'll edit the existing objects through the same endpoint. OK, now try to configure the mapping, and you can't, because the fields are not marked as available for writing. Go back to the Get Users Book endpoint and mark the status and ID fields, because you must have the ID available for reading and writing to edit objects. Go back to setting up the status model. The Read This Book button can change the objects, but to change a specific object, you must specify like this: ID equals the ID of an object from the card, where reading will be a constant in the status. You can add this button in the drop-down menu on the card. Let's enable the option, save the changes, and see how it looks. Here's the drop-down menu and, consequently, the action button that changed the status to Reading. You can also make the button appear on the card instead of a drop-down menu. Press the button and the status has changed. You can add a familiar message. OK. It will appear on the card after you press the button. There's also another option where the pop-up closes after the button is pressed. Next, let's deal with the action button conditionals. There's a whole list of them. For example, you can show the button only to authorized or to unauthorized users. Let's enable the second option. You can't see the button because you're logged in. Let's change the condition again and only show the button when the object has the status New. It worked. Let's change the status by pressing the button. See? There are no more buttons because all three objects have the status Reading. Let's add a similar button, Drop this book, which will change an object's status from Reading back to New, and it will only appear for objects with the status Reading. Don't forget, when editing an object, you must specify the ID as well as the status. The status is saved as a constant, New, and the conditional object field equals status Reading. Then save the changes and check them. Now we have two buttons, Drop and Read, substituting each other. Now it's time to configure sorting on the API endpoint. This will make books with the Reading status always appear at the beginning of the list. Choose to sort by status in descending order, as alphabetically, the Reading status always comes before the New status. Good. Sorting now works as we intended. Let's make the cards with the Reading status appear highlighted in green. To do this, you need to add another field, Color, and a scenario that will change the field according to its status. This scenario will use the user's book structure and the changed trigger, meaning the object will be processed by the scenario if its status changes. The first step is the condition for the status, Reading or New. Don't forget to add comment to the scenario, as usual. The scenario will include two edit objects, each one for a different status. Set the condition, status equals Reading. If yes, then the object goes up in this step, and the color changes to green. And if no, the color stays blank, with no highlight at all. Save the scenario and run it. Be sure to add this field as available for reading in the endpoint. Now go back to the component settings and choose Color in the Card Color field, and choose Border as the type of color labeling, so that when the field is filled in, the card will have a colored border. You'll have noticed that the highlight remained after you pressed the Drop This Book button. That's because the cards don't have time to update, because the status is updated first, then the cards, and only then does the scenario change the color. To change this, you need Socket I/O. a special plugin for updating the page from the scenario. Add the new component, Refresher plugin, to the My Books page, and fill in the name, Refresher, which is the event name. Then add the Socket I/O step to the scenario. And as usual, don't forget to add comments. Add an asterisk to the user ID field in the Socket I/O step because it will update the color for all users. Use Refresher as the event name, which is the same name you specified in the web page component. Let's check that it works. Press the button and… great! Now the color on the card changes, so the cards are updated instantly. Now let's add the option to leave a rating for books using an action button. To do that, you need to add another new field to the user's book structure, Rating. It will be a number, a positive one to be more precise. The rating will include grades from 1 to 5. Next, add another field, Rating, to the user request structure. It will be a JSON with radio options. You can customize it in various ways. Select the radio option, click Customize this field, and add 5 options, from 1 to 5 stars, with values from 1 to 5 in numbers. You should now add these fields to the API endpoints so they can be accessed from the web page. First, you need to configure new action buttons. Go to the Cards View settings and add a new action button, Rate this book. It will be a form plus button. Customize the button's appearance. Make it bright and add a message showing the new rating after it's pressed. This action button will create an object in the user's requests endpoint. The user needs to fill in the book rating field by applying the stars we just configured within the frames of this action. The mapping should provide the user's book ID, but there is no such field in the user request structure. Let's add it quickly. It will be a link to the user's book structure. Don't forget to add it as available for writing to the API endpoint the action button works with. Let's go back to configuring the components and action button. Sometimes you have to reselect the respective API endpoint to refresh the available read-write fields. Now let's finalize the mapping configuration. You must add the ID from the card to the user's book's ID field. Let's check the button is in place. Let's disable the color because we don't need it here. You now have a rating section on the book card. The only problem is, the field still has the system name because we forgot to add the displayed name to the structure. Let's do that now. Add the displayed name to the user's request structure. Resave the action button settings and check again. Now it looks right. But the action button is on all books with both the new and the reading status. Let's add another conditional. Status equals reading. So you'll only be able to rate books that you're reading. Now everything is correct. This action button only appears on cards with books I'm reading, and you see an error message when you consider leaving a rating. Remember how in the endpoint you set up validation for users' post requests, so they can't be tampered with. It works as we intended. In the API endpoint settings, you see that the user ID must equal the ID of the user who's working with the component. So let's change the mapping to user ID equals user's ID. It should all work now. Yes, just as expected. Now you need to process these objects. First, add the rating field to the endpoint as available for reading here. Next, you need a scenario to process new requests. You already have it. All you need to do is supplement it a bit. Take a look at a new object. It's missing a type. You need to edit the mapping in the action button slightly. Now add the request type field and a constant, rate book. Now try to leave a rating again. Great! You can work with this object now. The rating field has a JSON with a rating card and a link to the user's book to be rated. Add another condition to the scenario, like this. Request type equals rate book. Again, don't forget to add comments. If the type is rate book, the scenario writes the rating to the linked object, a user's book. By the way, you can use the templating tool because you have a JSON field. To do that, add this field, turn off Smart Input, and add a value, namely a property, after a dot. We'll cover this topic in more detail in future videos on scenarios. You can also add another field, whether or not the book has already been rated, so that it can only be rated once. Then add a Boolean type isRated field, which is either true or false, and add isRated equals true to the object changing step in the scenario. Next, to use the isRated field as a condition, add it to the API endpoint as available for reading. Then go to the action settings and remove the isRated field from displaying. That's a purely technical field, so you don't need it. Now we add another conditional, isRated equals false. Save and check the changes. Rate War and Peace with 5 stars. Update the card, and now you see the rating, and you can't rate it again.